Welcome to the TEFL Training Institute podcast, the bite-sized TEFL podcast for teachers, trainers, and managers. Hello, everyone.
Hi, folks.
Hey, and today we've got our regular podcast guest, Dave Weller.
Hello, everybody. I was trying not to say hurrah again. Regular listeners will know what I mean.
Dave's here this week to talk with us about a rather controversial issue,
which is native English-speaking teachers versus non-native English-speaking teachers.
So today we've got 3 questions. The first one is, what's all the fuss about? Second,
what do the parents and the students think about it? And the third one,
what can managers and schools do about it? Guys, what's the debate about?
well, based on my understanding, I think just schools, parents, and teachers and students, they feel, okay, different model of English, native or non-native, they've got advantages and disadvantages. So it seems more people, native English speaking teachers, and have a better model of English.
And as well as that, it seems like there's a bit of a tendency in the industry that native speakers who are teachers will tend to get paid more, native speakers who are teachers will tend to be given more opportunities.
Actually, I read about a study that looked at, I think, higher education institutions in the UK, and they found over 70% of them made hiring decisions for staff based on whether they were native or non-native speakers.
That doesn't surprise me a lot.
But it's almost like our whole methodology and approach to teaching language, doing everything in the students' L2 is almost based around having native speaking teachers, right?
Definitely. It goes really deep. And again, there's different levels of it. So it's fine if it just stayed as an opinion, but once it turns into action and policy and systems, you actually have, that's where discrimination kicks in and it becomes distinctly unfair and entrenched within our industry. And despite being what a lot of people think of as a very nice or liberal industry, it hides quite a lot of very dark secret.
And interestingly, if you do any sort of reading on this, you find that it becomes very difficult to define what a native speaker actually is. I mean, one thing that you can't deny is that the person grew up speaking English. But when you start to look at other criteria, they're very, very woolly. And it tends to be things like they can be creative with language, they don't have a foreign accent, they're aware of the culture of the language, all these things which clearly it's possible.
Of course, the non-native speakers have that as well.
Ultimately, you get to this point where really the only difference between the two is that one of them grew up speaking English and one didn't, which, if you're learning English from someone, is pretty irrelevant, isn't it? What language or what they did in their childhood, who cares about that?
Precisely. All you really care about is how well or how good they are as a teacher, how well they can connect with you in the classroom, they can motivate you, and all the other things that go into making up a good teacher. I think this whole argument actually needs to be rephrased into clearer lines.
Yeah.
Sylvana Richardson, actually, she mentioned in her
plenary,
that we need a new word for non-native speakers.
Yeah.
But for me, that word would just be English teachers. I think there's no point devolving that word into finer detail. I think you should actually go back up the chain. We're all English teachers, just some of us have different skills and backgrounds than others. And if you were to do that, it would solve a lot of these problems. So when you talk about a teacher, you go, okay, which languages can they speak? And at what level? And that way you can say, well, there's this, in the old part, there's this native speaking teacher who can speak a little bit of the learner's L1, but not to their level. And then there's a native speaker who can't speak any. Then there's a non-native speaker who is local to the area. And there's a non-native speaker that isn't local from the area.
Yeah, I think part of it is that linguistic determinism.
The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Made famous by the recent movie Arrival.
So this idea that because the language that we use, or we have to describe the teachers as native and non-native teachers or speakers, that's the thing that we end up focusing on. But if we changed it and say we called them monolingual or bilingual teachers, then which of those would you have a preference for?
I agree to a point, but this is why I might be against that.
Yeah, go on.
Because then, again, say everything goes as you plan, and then in 20 years' time, you actually might get a reverse situation where there's prejudice against native speakers because of the bilingualism versus monolingualism. So all I think you should do is revert back to the phrase teachers, and then what skills does that teacher have?
interesting in the research I'd done on this and the survey where I looked at parents, students, teachers and sales and service staff and asked every group. I had a bunch of different attributes in there. So for example, attitudes, qualifications, personalities, relationship with students, being native speakers, what people look like, their nationality and their ability to speak to students at L1. The number one thing was definitely not being a native speaker. That ranked about number 3 or number 4 in people's preference. But I think that the native or non-native speaker is, I guess people use that as a proxy. It's something that if you don't know anything about the industry, then you can relate to that very, very easily. But if you're a parent and you don't know anything about language learning, you're not going to know like what qualifications the teachers should have, or it's very difficult to see what the teachers' attitudes are or their personalities of any of those things. But it is quite simple to check, is this person a native speaker or not?
But I find it fascinating, to go back to non-native speakerism for a second. I was reading some of Adrian Holiday's work, but he said that it started out as almost a marketing ploy from various aid agencies back in the 60s to propagate the idea that native speakers were the best model, and in which case that obviously links up to the idea that Silvana Richardson said in her plenary, that we can change the perception in the industry. All it takes is a little time. And with research that backs us up, research coming out that actually says that it is not just okay, but beneficial to use L1 in the classroom. You put those things together, then this is the way forward, I think, to actually eradicate bias in our industry.
Let me play you that quote from Silvana now.
Employers always have choices. Collusion with inequality and prejudice is a choice. Discrimination is a choice. As Rajagopalan says, in our neoliberal world, who will dare challenge what the market dictates? The answer to this is, just because the market is demanding certain things, it does not mean that the market itself cannot be made to perceive things differently.
Do you think that's true? Is that realistic, though, that the market can be made to perceive?
It is, yeah.
It is,
definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look on an individual and on a mass scale, I mean, how many times have we changed our minds over the course of our professional development over the last 10, 15 years? And precisely the same thing with an industry. Industries change, ideas change, views change. And it happens usually, well, I would argue from the ground up rather than from directors from above, especially in industries such as ours, which is quite fragmented and has no overarching body to dictate the standards.
I still think there is a huge market, because you just look at the education companies like doing online or offline. Because the business, they create the scenario, and having native English teachers is the better choice.
So in that case, how do you think it's an easy or difficult or a long or short task to change the way that Chinese parents and students see local teachers?
I think it's going to be a long way. I have to say all the non-native teachers need to work really hard, because if you constantly make mistakes and you constantly misspell the word and you constantly use the utterances or expressions that people don't normally use and use those language to teach your students, I think there is a problem.
But this is where I feel it's so unfair, because I see a lot of really bad native speaking teachers who don't get picked up on making teaching mistakes or methodological mistakes.
Or even language mistakes of teaching language which is highly improbable, like possible, but doesn't often get used. And so they end up teaching, like, it's maybe not technically wrong, but you'll hear people teaching language that just never gets used.
They're from one particular part of like the deep south in America, and they use a phrase that only them and their family and like the people in that village use, and they're like,
exactly,
I've never heard it before. But yeah, I don't see them getting picked up on those mistakes. They tend to get a free pass because they're a native speaker. I think that's really unfair.
But still, when a lot of teachers or parents, they always say, oh, I want my student or my child to speak standard English, or the students should learn standard English.
There's no such thing anymore, is there?
I don't think so. And I think, is that like a cultural concept that exists in China? So there is a standard Chinese, but there's not a standard English.
To play devil's advocate just for a second, I can kind of understand what they mean, though. Even though we're looking at it from a technician's point of view, we're looking at it from a point of view of your professionals in the industry. I think what parents mean is almost like the shadows on Plato's cave. To take it deep for a second, like the concept of a horse, despite all horses can look slightly different. Again, they're using that term as a proxy for English that will be understood around the world, no matter where they go. It'll be effortlessly be able to communicate with other English-speaking teachers and not be hindered in any way through pronunciation or grammar or phrase. I think that's shorthand for what they're trying to say.
Indeed. But is it not also the case that a very, very small percentage of learners will learn English or an accent accent or something to the point where they're at that level, you know, of I want to sound English or I want to sound American, but really, like for most of the students I've taught, even after years, they sound Chinese because
maybe your students, Ross. Sorry, that's such a flippant answer. But no, I completely agree with your point. And in fact, I'd even add to that and say it's not about increasing their level, it's about teaching them the skills to grade their language if they do encounter another non-native speaker who, you know, has trouble understanding their accent, maybe because they're from quite a different culture. But again, you're arguing against a perception and a belief.
So, can we talk for a minute then about language schools and maybe what language schools can do about that? I've got another Silvana quote for you. Do you mind if I play this briefly?
Please do.
This is part of the California, Nevada's position paper opposing discrimination against non-native English-speaking teachers. And it says, teaching job announcements that indicate a preference or requirement for a native speaker of English trivialize the professional development teachers have received and teaching experience they have already acquired. Such announcements are also discriminatory and ultimately harm all teachers, native or not, by devaluing teacher education, professionalism, and experience.
To what extent do you guys agree or disagree with
100%.
that? Yeah?
100%. I can only really speak with authority from my background, which is as a native speaker.
Yeah.
But again, it does trivialise my experience and the amount of work I've put into over the last 15 years of professional development,
Getting
studying.
qualifications and things, yeah.
Precisely, the extra work I've put in, thousands of hours, and then to be reduced to being called, he's a native speaker. He'll do.
It's interesting. But it still happens so often, right? Like Tracy, you had something like that a few weeks ago of organising a teacher training thing here, and again, you've obviously got your diploma, you're studying your MA, you've been a tutor and a course director on accredited courses, and the people running the course said, can you make sure there's a native speaker, a foreigner, for at least half the course,
who's just finished a 40-hour online course perhaps,
or maybe not even that. But isn't it fascinating that still persists?
They even didn't care about what qualifications or experience they have, and just make sure. And also interesting, the person from the organization, they even asked me, so can you tell me more about this trainer? I said, okay, so maybe I can ask this person to send the CVs and training teaching experience. She said, I really don't care about it, so just tell me his age, which country he's from, and also if he's white or black.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, what about on the flip side for a minute then, Dave? Like, because, as someone who used to be a director of studies before in a school where you had to make, like, hiring decisions, like, where's the sort of balance? Or, were you ever in some sort of tough situations there?
Yes.
How did that work out then?
Well, the thing is, as a manager, anyone that's been a manager, I'm sure, can relate to this, is you have to pick and choose your battles. That was the one that I'd actually go to bat for. If we had several candidates and various degrees of discrimination and different things, as one that Tracy mentioned earlier, about someone's skin colour, also about non-native speaking teachers, and you just go, well, no, actually, this person is qualified, they're capable, they've gone through the interview process, and that they would be a good fit for this team, they'd be a good fit for this country, and they'd be a great fit for our school. And then you'd put your foot down, you'd have an argument almost with the culture of the school, and if you won, some cases, sometimes you did, sometimes you didn't, and often, unfortunately, it depended on how badly the school needed teachers, how many classes waiting you had, how many students waiting to start class, unfortunately, was usually the deciding factor. But once a teacher arrived, whereas the students, after a few lessons, would be delighted with the experienced teacher, and the parents would turn and become delighted and insist upon having that teacher as a future teacher for their children. It's almost sad that we actually have to do this. Or that it's something that we do have to get passionate about and do spread the word on. I'm very optimistic about it. I like to think there are enough people out there that people will go back, spread the word and take small actions, and there will be this groundswell of people that do this.
All right, Dave, thanks very much for coming on. It was a pleasure talking to you again.
It's a pleasure to be here as always. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
For more podcasts, videos, and blogs, visit our website www.tefltraininginstitute.com.
If you've got a question or a topic you'd like us to discuss, leave us a comment.
And if you want to keep up to date with our latest content, add us on WeChat at TEFL Training Institute.
And if you enjoyed our podcast, please rate us on iTunes.